There is a quiet quality to the galaxy of Star Wars when it is observed at a distance, removed from the urgency of battles and the sharp clarity of hero and villain. In that stillness, patterns begin to emerge. Decisions echo forward through generations. Small gestures reshape history. Ancient philosophies bend beneath the weight of fear, hope, and time. This documentary is not concerned with what happens on the surface of the story, but with what lingers underneath it. The ideas that feel half buried, the implications never spoken aloud, and the theories that arise when the saga is treated not as spectacle, but as a historical record of a fallen civilization. What follows is a slow journey through the most transformative interpretations of this galaxy, examined as one might study lost empires or forgotten religions. And there is no urgency here, only observation, reflection, and the gentle unraveling of meaning. Long before senates convened beneath vaulted domes, before robes signified authority, and before the word Jedi carried moral weight, the Force existed without language, without hierarchy, and without intention. It did not wait to be discovered. It did not require belief. It simply was. In the earliest periods of galactic history, the Force appears less as a doctrine and more as a condition of reality itself, closer to gravity or time than to faith. It moved through all living things not as a guiding voice, but as a quiet current, indifferent to morality, untouched by ideology. The mistake of later civilizations was not in sensing the Force, but in attempting to define it too narrowly, to confine something vast into systems that could be taught, enforced, and preserved. Ancient records, fragmented and often contradictory, may suggest that early Force-sensitive cultures did not view themselves as chosen or elevated. They understood sensitivity to the Force as a form of attunement rather than superiority, to feel it was no more sacred than to hear or see. It was simply another way of perceiving the universe. In these early interpretations, the Force was not divided into light and dark. Such distinctions had not yet hardened into belief. There was only flow, imbalance, and consequence. This understanding changed gradually, not through revelation, but through fear. As societies grew more complex, so too did their relationship with the Force. What was once intuitive became dangerous. Those who could influence minds, move matter, or glimpse possibilities unsettled emerging political structures. No power that could not be regulated became power that had to be controlled. And so, slowly, observation turned into categorization. Categorization became philosophy. Philosophy, over time, became law. The Force did not change during this transition. What changed was how it was framed. By the time the earliest precursors to the Jedi Order emerged, the Force had already been reshaped into something closer to a moral axis than a natural phenomenon. This reframing was subtle, almost invisible. Instead of asking what the Force is, institutions began asking how it should be used. The shift from understanding to regulation marked the first quiet fracture in galactic balance. The earliest Jedi texts speak less of heroism and more of restraint. There is an anxiety woven into their language, a sense that emotion itself was a destabilizing force. Their passion was no longer a natural response to existence, but a threat. Attachment was reclassified as weakness. The living, unpredictable nature of the Force was gradually disciplined into something safer, quieter, and easier to govern. Yet in doing so, The Jedi altered the relationship between sentient beings and the Force in a fundamental way. What had once flowed through all life equally was now mediated through doctrine. Access became conditional. Interpretation became centralized. The Force, once universal, began to feel proprietary. This was not an act of malice. It was an act of preservation. From the Jedi perspective, history had already demonstrated what unrestrained Force use could do. Ancient conflicts, half myth, half memory, spoke of devastation not caused by armies, but by individuals. Worlds scarred not by fleets, but by wills imposed upon reality itself. To the early Jedi, structure was not oppression, it was survival. But structure has a cost. By defining the Force as something that must be balanced through suppression, of desire, of fear, of love, the Jedi began treating human experience as a flaw rather than a feature. The irony is difficult to miss when viewed from a distance. In seeking harmony, they introduced imbalance. In attempting to eliminate darkness, they gave it shape. The concept of the dark side did not emerge because darkness was discovered. It emerged because certain aspects of the Force were deemed unacceptable. Anger, ambition, grief, and attachment did not vanish when forbidden. They simply went unnamed, unexamined, and eventually underground. Here lies the central tension of early Force philosophy. And the Force itself never demanded moral alignment. It responded to intention, intensity, and focus. A healer and a destroyer could draw from the same current, differing only in purpose. The Jedi, however, insisted on moral absolutism. They taught that serenity was not a state of mind, but a requirement for legitimacy. Over generations, this belief hardened into identity. To be a Jedi was not merely to study the Force, but to embody an idealized emotional state that few sentient beings could naturally maintain. The Order did not simply train Force sensitives, it filtered them, shaping personalities as much as abilities. Those who could not conform were not always punished. Often they were simply excluded. An exclusion, when combined with power, creates echoes. Long before the Sith were named, yet the conditions for their emergence were already present. Wherever emotion was treated as corruption, there would be those who embraced it as truth. Wherever restraint was idealized, intensity would feel like liberation. The dark side was not a deviation from the Force. It was a response to how the Force had been framed. What is often overlooked is that the Jedi did not invent peace. They managed instability. Their presence coincided with the Republic, not because they were moral guardians, but because they were useful. They offered predictability in a universe where unpredictability could shatter governments. Over time, their philosophical rigidity became indistinguishable from political necessity. This alliance between spiritual authority and state power further distorted the Jedi's relationship with the Force, as decisions were no longer made solely in pursuit of balance, but in service of continuity. Stability became virtue. Change became threat. The Force, however, does not recognize political eras. It continued to move through beings who were angry, afraid, hopeful, loving, and desperate. It answered not to codes, but to connection. The more the Jedi attempted to narrow its expression, the more violently it seemed to surface elsewhere, through schisms, exiles, and eventually open opposition. Seen through this lens, the great conflicts of later centuries were not sudden tragedies, but delayed consequences. The fall of institutions begins not with betrayal, but with misinterpretation. By redefining the Force as something that must be controlled rather than understood, the galaxy set itself on a path where balance would always be pursued through extremes. Before the Republic, the Force was not light or dark. It was motion. Before the Jedi, it was not moral. It was responsive. And before doctrine, it belonged to no one. The tragedy of galactic history is not that the Force was abused, but that it was misunderstood so early and so completely. In the next chapter, we will examine how this misunderstanding hardened into doctrine and how wisdom, once flexible and adaptive, became something brittle enough to shatter under its own weight. The transformation of wisdom into doctrine rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a declaration, nor does it feel like a loss while it is happening. More often, it presents as refinement, a necessary clarification meant to preserve what is fragile. In the case of the Jedi Order, this transformation unfolded slowly, across generations, as living insight was translated into repeatable instruction and guidance hardened into rule. At the beginning, there was no single order. There were gatherings, lineages, and teachers whose understanding of the Force was deeply personal and often contradictory. This plurality was not seen as a weakness. Differences in interpretation were expected, even welcomed, because the Force itself appeared to express differently through different lives. One individual might experience it as intuition, and another as empathy, another as heightened awareness of probability. There was no universal method, only shared attentiveness. But attentiveness does not scale easily. As Force-sensitive populations became more visible, and as the early Republic expanded its reach, the need for consistency grew louder. Parents wanted assurance. Governments wanted predictability. And teachers, confronted with students of wildly varying temperament, sought ways to reduce harm. The impulse to standardize did not arise from arrogance, but from concern. This is where wisdom began to change its shape. What had once been context-dependent guidance, responding to individual temperament, culture, and emotional capacity, was gradually codified into general principles. These principles, initially flexible, were written down not to constrain, but to remember. Over time, however, what was written came to be treated as complete rather than provisional. Interpretation narrowed. Debate softened. And the living relationship between teacher and student was slowly replaced by curriculum. Doctrine offers comfort. It suggests permanence in a universe defined by flux. For the Jedi, doctrine became a way to preserve balance by limiting variation. Emotional detachment was emphasized not because emotion was evil, but because it was unpredictable. Attachment was discouraged, not because love was corrupt, but because loss could lead to destabilizing grief. Yet the cost of this approach was subtle and cumulative. By teaching that serenity was the ideal state, the Jedi reframed emotional life as a problem to be managed rather than a signal to be understood. Fear was not explored, it was suppressed, whereas anger was not contextualized. It was forbidden. Grief was not integrated. It was endured in silence. Over time, this produced a culture of inward restraint that prized control above comprehension. The Force, however, does not respond to suppression in the same way it responds to understanding. Students trained under increasingly rigid doctrine learn to police themselves internally, measuring every feeling against an external standard of acceptability. This created an internal dissonance. Emotions still arose, but acknowledgement of them felt like failure. The result was not peace, but quiet tension, a kind of philosophical compression that intensified rather than dissolved emotional energy. The Jedi did not lose their way because they lacked insight. They lost it because they overtrusted their conclusions. Doctrine also altered the power dynamics within the Order. Wisdom, once distributed across many voices, became centralized. Councils replaced conversations. Rank replaced experience. The Force itself, once interpreted through lived reality, was increasingly filtered through institutional authority. To disagree with doctrine was no longer to explore, it was to deviate. This shift was reinforced by the Jedi's evolving relationship with the state. As the Galactic Republic matured, it leaned on the Jedi not just as philosophers, but as stabilizers. The Order's predictability made it valuable. Their code reassured senators that Force wielders could be trusted. In exchange for autonomy, the Jedi accepted proximity to power. In exchange for influence, they accepted responsibility. Responsibility, however, reshapes belief. Yet to serve the Republic effectively, the Jedi had to present a unified front. Public doubt could undermine confidence. Internal disagreement, once a source of growth, became a liability. Doctrine thus served not only spiritual aims, but political ones. It simplified messaging. It reduced risk. It made the Order legible to those who feared it. This convergence of spiritual and political necessity further entrenched rigidity. What began as guidance became expectation. What began as expectation became identity. Young initiates were no longer encouraged to ask what the Force meant to them. They were taught what it meant. Meditation became technique rather than inquiry. The code, once a poetic framework, was recited as law. In seeking to protect students from inner turmoil, the Jedi deprived them of the tools needed to navigate it. But there is a quiet paradox here. The Jedi feared that emotional attachment would lead to selfishness, yet their doctrine fostered a different kind of self-focus, constant self-surveillance. When every feeling must be assessed for acceptability, attention turns inward in a way that is neither compassionate nor freeing. Over time, the Order produced individuals who were calm in appearance but unresolved beneath the surface. This was not universal, but it was common enough to matter. The Force amplified what already existed. Unexamined fear did not disappear. It grew more potent. Suppressed desire did not fade. It sharpened. The dark side did not emerge as rebellion against goodness, but as an answer to emotional honesty denied elsewhere. Importantly, none of this required malice or corruption. The Jedi believed they were preserving balance, and in many eras they succeeded. Temporarily. But doctrine excels at maintaining stability, not at adapting to change. As the galaxy evolved, the Jedi remained anchored to conclusions drawn in a different age. Wisdom, when alive, listens. Doctrine, by contrast, repeats. The first mistake of the Jedi Order was not arrogance, nor blindness, nor even fear. It was certainty. By believing they had defined the correct relationship with the Force, they closed themselves to the possibility that balance might look different across time, culture, and individual experience. The tragedy is that the Force never demanded such certainty. It responds to presence, not perfection. It moves through beings as they are, not as institutions wish them to be. In attempting to purify interaction with the Force, the Jedi narrowed it. In attempting to eliminate darkness, they ensured it would gather elsewhere, unnamed and unaddressed. This doctrinal rigidity did not immediately cause collapse. It laid groundwork. It created conditions. It shaped generations who believed that deviation was danger and that emotional truth was threat. In the next chapter, we will explore how these conditions did not merely allow the rise of the Sith, but made them unavoidable. How opposition was not an aberration, but a structural consequence of certainty itself. History often comforts itself with the idea of villains as anomalies. It prefers to believe that great oppositions emerge from singular corruption, from a fall that could have been prevented if only one decision had gone differently. But when the long arc of galactic history is examined without urgency, without moral shorthand, a different pattern becomes visible. The Sith were not an accident. They were not a deviation. They were a response. To understand this, one must let go of the assumption that the Force naturally divides itself into good and evil. That division did not originate in the Force. It originated in interpretation. Once the Jedi defined acceptable and unacceptable ways of engaging with the Force, they created conceptual boundaries. And wherever boundaries exist, pressure accumulates. But the Sith emerged not because individuals desired domination, but because entire dimensions of experience had been declared illegitimate. In the earliest schisms, there is little evidence of malice. The first figures later associated with Sith philosophy were often former Jedi, students, scholars, or teachers who questioned the Order's conclusions rather than its intentions. They did not initially reject balance. They rejected denial. They asked whether anger could be understood rather than suppressed, whether passion could be disciplined rather than erased, whether attachment could be navigated rather than forbidden. These questions were not welcomed. Doctrine, once established, defends itself by framing dissent as danger. To question emotional suppression was to risk chaos. To explore ambition was to invite corruption. And so, yet those who pressed these inquiries found themselves isolated, not always exiled, but subtly removed from influence. Dialogue narrowed. Curiosity became suspicion. Isolation is a powerful catalyst. Cut off from institutional legitimacy, these early dissenters were forced to rely on personal experience rather than communal validation. In doing so, they discovered something the Jedi had long refused to articulate openly. The Force responds with equal intensity to focus born of pain, desire, and conviction. Emotion did not weaken connection. In many cases, it strengthened it. This realization did not feel like corruption to those who experienced it. It felt like honesty. Over time, shared isolation became shared identity. What began as philosophical divergence slowly crystallized into counter-doctrine. If the Jedi define virtue as restraint, then intensity became virtue elsewhere. If serenity was elevated, then passion was reclaimed, not as indulgence, but as fuel. This was the moment inevitability took root. Once the Jedi framed emotional engagement with the Force as inherently dangerous, any tradition that embraced emotion would be cast as dark by default. The label preceded the behavior. The moral conclusion was drawn before the philosophy could fully form. The Sith Order did not begin as an empire-building machine. It began as an answer to a question the Jedi refused to ask. What if the problem is not emotion, but avoidance of it? This inversion reshaped everything. Where the Jedi sought harmony through detachment, the Sith sought clarity through intensity. Where the Jedi feared loss, the Sith accepted it as transformative. But where the Jedi attempted to dissolve the self into balance, the Sith sharpened the self into purpose. Neither approach was inherently balanced, but only one was permitted. It is important to note that the Sith philosophy did not immediately gravitate toward cruelty or domination. Early Sith texts speak less of conquest and more of liberation, from imposed restraint, from emotional denial, from institutional hypocrisy. Power was framed not as entitlement, but as responsibility to one's own potential. However, power without external restraint tends to turn inward before it turns outward. Without communal structures capable of moderating excess, Sith traditions became increasingly self-referential. Strength became proof of correctness. Survival became validation. The Force, responding to intensity, rewarded focus regardless of consequence. Over generations, this created a feedback loop. Emotion fueled power. Power reinforced belief. Belief justified further extremity. This is where fear entered the equation, not as origin, but as outcome. The Jedi, observing the destructive potential of unrestrained Force use, pointed to the Sith as evidence that their doctrine was necessary. The Sith, experiencing exclusion and opposition, interpreted resistance as confirmation of Jedi arrogance. Each side became the other's justification. Balance was no longer the goal. Supremacy was. From a distance, this conflict is often framed as light versus dark. But such framing obscures the deeper truth. The real divide was not moral. It was methodological. The Jedi believed stability came from limitation. The Sith believed truth came from expansion. It both misunderstood the Force by insisting on singular answers. What made the Sith inevitable was not their hunger for power, but the absence of any sanctioned space within the Jedi Order for emotional integration. When an institution claims total authority over meaning, it leaves no room for alternative interpretations to coexist peacefully. Dissent, when consistently marginalized, does not disappear. It reorganizes. The rule of two, often cited as evidence of Sith cruelty, can be understood instead as adaptation. After repeated failures caused by infighting, the Sith refined themselves into a lineage model that prioritized focus over numbers. This was not chaos. It was discipline of a different kind, one born from scarcity rather than abundance. In contrast, the Jedi relied on institutional continuity. They trusted that numbers were tradition and moral authority would preserve them. Both approaches were responses to the same reality. The Force amplifies what already exists within those who touch it. neither side fully accounted for this. The Sith did not emerge because the Jedi were wrong about the dangers of emotion. They emerged because the Jedi were incomplete. By refusing to engage openly with fear, anger, and desire, the Order ensured that those elements would be explored elsewhere, without guidance, without balance, and eventually, without restraint. Seen this way, the Sith are less a corruption of the Force and more a mirror held up to Jedi certainty. Every era that attempts to suppress fundamental aspects of sentient experience will generate a countercurrent. This is not a failure of morality. It is a function of psychology. Emotion does not dissolve under prohibition. It concentrates. The galaxy did not fall because darkness existed. Darkness has always existed. It fell because institutions believed they could erase it rather than understand it. By the time the Sith became openly antagonistic, the conditions that shaped them were long established. The conflict that would later consume the Republic was already encoded into the philosophical architecture of Force study itself. The war was not triggered by betrayal. It was activated by inevitability. In the next chapter, we will turn to prophecy, the language of destiny and balance, and examine how a single misunderstood prediction reframed an entire generation's expectations, placing unbearable weight on one individual and mistaking inevitability for design. Prophecy is a fragile instrument. It invites certainty where none can be proven, and it offers reassurance precisely when doubt would be more honest. In the long history of Force traditions, few ideas have carried as much weight and caused as much quiet distortion as the belief in a singular figure destined to restore balance. The tragedy of the Chosen One was not that the prophecy failed. It was that it was taken literally. Within Jedi archives, the prophecy is preserved with reverence, repeated as though repetition itself could stabilize its meaning. It speaks of balance, of an end to darkness, of restoration. What it does not specify is method, duration, or cost. It does not explain whether balance is an outcome, a process, or a recurring state. Yet the Order treated it as a solution rather than a description. This distinction matters. In ancient Force cultures, prophecy was not prediction. It was pattern recognition. It named tendencies observed across time, the way imbalance invites correction, the way extremes collapse under their own weight. Such prophecies were meant to cultivate humility, reminding societies that no structure is permanent and no victory final. The Jedi, however, encountered prophecy during an era of institutional confidence. They did not read it as warning. They read it as validation. By framing balance as something that would be achieved through a single individual, the Order externalized responsibility. Balance was no longer a collective practice requiring constant attention. It became a future event. This subtly shifted the Jedi's relationship with the present. Instead of asking how imbalance was already forming within their ranks, and they waited for resolution to arrive from outside. Expectation replaced introspection. When the prophecy began to be associated with Anakin Skywalker, the shift from symbol to burden was complete. An idea meant to describe the Force's self-correcting nature was compressed into a single life. From that moment, Anakin ceased to be a person first. He became a vessel for meaning imposed upon him before he could consent to it. This imposition altered how the Jedi perceived evidence. Every anomaly was interpreted as confirmation. Unprecedented power was seen not as a question, but as proof. Fear, volatility, and attachment, traits that might have prompted care and contextual understanding in another student, were reframed as obstacles to destiny. The prophecy did not merely predict balance, it demanded it. There is a quiet cruelty in this demand. To be told that one will bring balance is to be denied the freedom to be uncertain. Mistakes become signs of failure rather than opportunities for growth. Suffering becomes instrumental rather than personal. In Anakin's case, pain was not treated as something to be alleviated, but as something to be endured for a greater outcome. The Jedi believed they were honoring the prophecy by training him. In truth, they were interpreting him through it. This is where misreading becomes dangerous. Balance, as understood by the Force, is not the elimination of darkness. It is the dynamic equilibrium between opposing forces, creation and destruction, attachment and release, fear and courage. The Jedi, however, equated balance with the absence of the Sith. Darkness became synonymous with imbalance, rather than one of its components. In such an equation collapses complexity. If balance is defined as the removal of one side of a spectrum, then any action that achieves this removal, no matter how violent, can be justified. The prophecy, stripped of nuance, became a moral shortcut. It allowed the Order to believe that history was moving toward resolution, even as their own rigidity intensified imbalance. Anakin's eventual actions are often described as the prophecy's failure or fulfillment, depending on interpretation. But this binary misses the deeper truth. The prophecy was neither fulfilled nor broken. It was enacted in the only way possible given how it was understood. By contributing to the near extinction of the Jedi and the collapse of the Sith's traditional structures, Anakin did, in a sense, reset the Force's dominant institutions. Balance was not achieved through harmony, but through devastation. This outcome is uncomfortable precisely because it exposes the flaw in the Jedi's assumption that balance would be gentle, controlled, and aligned with their moral framework. The Force did not promise comfort. What the prophecy described was not salvation, but correction. Systems that grow too rigid eventually fracture. Power that concentrates without reflection invites counterforce. In this reading, the Chosen One was not meant to save the Jedi or destroy the Sith, but to dismantle an era defined by extremes. Seen this way, Anakin's life becomes less a moral lesson and more a historical mechanism. He did not stand above the system. He was shaped by it, strained by it, and ultimately used by it. By the Jedi's expectations and the Sith's exploitation alike. And both sides saw destiny where there was only pressure. Prophecy, when treated as instruction, absolves institutions of responsibility. It allows them to endure without adapting, trusting that fate will intervene. This may be the prophecy's most enduring danger. It encourages waiting when action is required, belief when listening would be wiser. Balance does not arrive through chosen individuals alone. It emerges when systems remain flexible enough to integrate contradiction. The Jedi, by anchoring hope in a singular outcome, neglected the work of continual adjustment. The prophecy became a lens that narrowed vision rather than expanding it. In the next chapter, we will move from prophecy to person, from abstract expectation to lived experience, and examine how Anakin Skywalker's life reveals not the corruption of an individual, but the cumulative failures of an institution unable to reconcile compassion with control. Oh, understand, Anakin Skywalker is not to search for the moment he fell, but to observe the environment in which falling became the most coherent response available to him. His story, when removed from the language of betrayal and temptation, reads less like a moral collapse and more like an extended misalignment between human need and institutional design. Anakin entered the Jedi world late, already shaped by fear, attachment, and memory. This alone set him apart. The Order preferred initiates whose emotional landscapes were still undefined, whose bonds could be replaced rather than untangled. For Anakin, bonds were not theoretical. They were survival mechanisms. His earliest experiences taught him that love could be taken without warning, that safety was temporary, and that powerlessness had consequences. But the Jedi recognized this difference. They named it risk. What they did not name was responsibility. From the moment Anakin was accepted, he was treated as an exception, necessary, dangerous, and provisional. This status produced a quiet contradiction. He was expected to fulfill destiny while simultaneously being distrusted for the very traits that made him unique. Praise and suspicion coexisted without reconciliation. Such conditions do not foster balance. They produce vigilance. Training within the Order emphasized control over comprehension. When Anakin struggled, the response was not curiosity, but correction. Fear was addressed through admonition rather than inquiry. Attachment was framed as weakness, rather than as an understandable response to loss. In this environment, the emotional expression became evidence of inadequacy rather than information about internal state. The result was emotional solitude. Anakin learned quickly which parts of himself were acceptable. He also learned which parts were not. This knowledge did not erase those parts. It taught him to hide them. Over time, concealment became habit. Habit became identity. The Jedi believed they were teaching discipline. In practice, they were training dissociation. This matters because the Force does not respond to presented selves. It responds to actual ones. As Anakin's power grew, so did the intensity of his inner life. His visions were not abstract. They were visceral, anchored in memory and fear. When he foresaw loss, he did not interpret it as symbolic. He relived it. Yet the Order's guidance remained consistent. Accept impermanence, release attachment, trust the Force. These instructions assume a foundation of emotional security that Anakin did not possess. To someone whose earliest bonds were severed violently, the concept of release feels less like wisdom and more like surrender to inevitability. The Jedi spoke of acceptance. Anakin heard abandonment. Without intending to, the Order reinforced the very fear they sought to dissolve. It is often said that Anakin's downfall was driven by attachment. This framing is incomplete. Attachment did not cause his fall. Unacknowledged attachment did. Love that cannot be spoken does not disappear. It concentrates. Fear that cannot be shared does not soften. It sharpens. Within the Jedi structure, there was no sanctioned language for this internal reality. Confession risked consequence. Vulnerability risked removal. And so Anakin turned inward, constructing a private logic where responsibility for preventing loss rested entirely on his own capacity for control. This is where institutional failure becomes structural rather than personal. An institution that claims moral authority must account for the full range of human experience it encounters. The Jedi did not lack compassion. They lacked adaptability. Their framework was built for stability, not trauma. When confronted with a student whose needs exceeded their categories, they attempted to fit him into the framework rather than revise the framework itself. The tension between Anakin and the Council illustrates this clearly. He was asked to act as a protector while being denied trust. He was expected to be transparent while being excluded from decision-making. As these contradictions did not feel philosophical to him, they felt relational. And relationships, once strained, rarely heal through abstraction. Into this gap stepped an alternative voice, one that did not deny fear, but named it. One that did not condemn desire, but reframed it as strength. This voice did not need to be virtuous to be effective. It needed only to be present where the Jedi were distant. Anakin's turn is often depicted as sudden. In truth, it was incremental. Each small dismissal, each moment of emotional isolation, each instruction that prioritized ideal over individual contributed to a narrowing of perceived options. By the time a choice presented itself, it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like coherence. What is most revealing is not that Anakin fell, but that the Jedi were surprised when he did, as they had mistaken compliance for integration. Anakin followed rules. He performed duties. He fought wars. But his inner world remained unresolved. The Order mistook silence for serenity. In doing so, they ignored the accumulating pressure beneath the surface. This is not to absolve Anakin of responsibility. It is to contextualize it. Agency exists within constraint. Choices emerge from available frameworks. When an institution defines emotional honesty as threat and obedience as virtue, it shapes the moral landscape in which decisions are made. Anakin's tragedy was not that he felt too much. It was that there was nowhere safe for those feelings to go. In the end, his transformation did not represent the corruption of a hero, but the exposure of a system's blind spots. Yet the Jedi believed that eliminating darkness within themselves would protect the galaxy. Anakin revealed that denying darkness merely relocates it. If the Jedi Order failed Anakin, it was not through cruelty or neglect, but through certainty. They believed they knew what balance required. They believed discipline could substitute for understanding. They believed that the Force, if approached correctly, would reward restraint with peace. The Force did not share these assumptions. Anakin's life demonstrates that power magnifies unresolved conflict. It does not resolve it. Institutions that cultivate power without cultivating emotional integration create instability at scale. In this sense, Anakin was not an aberration. He was a forecast. In the next chapter, we will shift focus from the individual shaped by the system to the individual who understood the system perfectly, examining how patience, legality, and institutional trust became the most effective weapons of all. Power, when it announces itself, invites resistance. The most enduring forms of power do the opposite. They arrive quietly, clothed in procedure, justified by necessity, and sustained by the belief that nothing dangerous is happening yet. Few figures in galactic history understood this more completely than Sheev Palpatine. Not as a tyrant in waiting, but as an administrator of inevitability. Palpatine did not seize control of the Republic. He allowed it to place control in his hands. This distinction is essential. Where the Sith of earlier eras sought domination through force, Palpatine recognized that institutions collapse most reliably when they believe they are functioning normally. His genius was not cruelty, but patience. He understood that fear does not need to be created if it can be curated, and that authority is most stable when it appears to be temporary. From the beginning, Palpatine presented himself as unremarkable. His public persona was not charismatic, but reassuring. He did not promise transformation. He promised continuity. In a galaxy weary of conflict and uncertainty, this promise carried immense weight. Stability, even when hollow, is often preferred to reform that risks discomfort. Palpatine's true innovation lay in his relationship to time. Unlike the Jedi, who believed balance could be preserved through vigilance, Palpatine believed outcomes could be engineered through sequence. Each decision he influenced was small enough to appear reasonable in isolation. Emergency powers were framed as safeguards. Military expansion was justified as deterrence. Surveillance was introduced as protection. No single step appeared tyrannical. Together, they became irreversible. This is how patience becomes a weapon. Palpatine did not oppose the Jedi directly, because opposition clarifies lines. Instead, he relied on their assumptions. He understood their doctrine well enough to exploit its blind spots. The Jedi trusted process. They trusted legality. They trusted that evil would reveal itself through transgression rather than compliance. Palpatine transgressed nothing. Even his rise within the political hierarchy depended on consent. The Senate voted. The systems responded as designed. Each transfer of authority followed established protocol. The Republic did not recognize its own transformation because it had no framework for identifying lawful decay. This is where Palpatine's Sith philosophy diverged sharply from that of his predecessors. While he did not seek to dominate the Force through intensity alone, he sought to synchronize political structure with psychological pressure. Fear was not deployed suddenly. It was normalized. War, in this context, was not a means of conquest, but a conditioning environment. The Clone Wars exhausted the Republic emotionally and administratively. Resources were strained. Decision-making became reactive. In such conditions, deliberation feels irresponsible. Speed becomes virtue. Authority consolidates not through demand, but through relief. Palpatine positioned himself as the only figure capable of bearing the burden of endless crisis. The Jedi, bound by doctrine and expectation, misread this entirely. They searched for a Sith Lord who would break rules, not one who would right them, as their investigations assumed hostility would manifest as disruption. Palpatine instead embedded himself within normality. His presence became synonymous with the Republic's survival. To remove him would feel like destabilization. This is the quiet brilliance of institutional capture. The threat becomes indistinguishable from the system it inhabits. Palpatine also understood the psychological cost of vigilance. Constant alertness erodes clarity. The Jedi, tasked with fighting a war while maintaining moral authority, were stretched beyond their philosophical capacity. Their meditation became strategic. Their restraint became performance. Palpatine did not need to deceive them continually. He needed only to let exhaustion do its work. His relationship with Anakin was an extension of this strategy, not an emotional attachment, but a long-term investment. Where the Jedi offered ideals, Palpatine offered recognition. Where they spoke in abstractions, he spoke in personal terms. He did not deny Anakin's fear. He contextualized it. He did not condemn desire. He gave it purpose. This was not mentorship in the traditional sense. It was alignment. Palpatine did not rush this alignment. He allowed contradiction to build slowly between what Anakin was told and what he experienced. Each time the Jedi withheld trust, Palpatine provided it. Each time the Order emphasized restraint, Palpatine emphasized agency. Over time, these contrasts formed a narrative in which the Jedi appeared rigid and dismissive, while Palpatine appeared understanding and adaptive. Crucially, Palpatine never asked Anakin to betray the Jedi outright, and he allowed Anakin to reach that conclusion himself. Agency, when self-attributed, feels righteous. This pattern mirrors Palpatine's broader strategy. He did not force the Republic to accept the Empire. He allowed the Republic to become the Empire by extension. The name changed after the structure had already shifted. By the time the transformation was declared, resistance felt impractical rather than heroic. What makes Palpatine particularly effective is that he did not need secrecy forever. He needed it only until revelation no longer mattered. Once power is normalized, exposure becomes theater. By the time he revealed his true identity, the systems capable of opposing him had already been compromised or repurposed. The Jedi's final mistake was assuming that moral clarity equated to strategic awareness, as they believed that knowing right from wrong would protect them from manipulation. Palpatine understood that morality, when unexamined, can be anticipated. He did not exploit their weaknesses. He exploited their predictability. This is the deeper lesson of Palpatine's rise. Institutions often prepare for overt threats while ignoring subtle ones. They train for invasion, not erosion. They watch for enemies at the gates, not for advisors in the chamber. Palpatine's patience allowed him to become inevitable. By the time the Jedi moved to act, their options were constrained by legality, optics, and precedent. Any decisive intervention would appear illegitimate. Any hesitation would appear complicit. This is the bind Palpatine engineered, a situation in which every available choice benefited him. In the end, Palpatine did not defeat the Jedi in battle. He rendered battle unnecessary. Order 66 succeeded not because it was brutal, but because it was procedural. Soldiers followed commands. Systems executed protocols. Violence occurred within the language of duty. The galaxy did not fall into tyranny, screaming. It signed forms. Palpatine's legacy is often framed in terms of evil, But this framing is insufficient. He represents something more unsettling: the capacity for systems to undo themselves when guided by individuals who understand them better than they understand themselves. In the next chapter, we will examine the conflict that made this transformation possible, not as a war of opposing sides, but as a predetermined ritual that exhausted every alternative before a single decisive move was ever made. Wars are often remembered for their battles, but they are shaped long before the first shot is fired. By the time the Clone Wars erupted into open conflict, their outcome had already been encoded into the systems that allowed them to exist. What appeared to be a struggle between opposing ideologies was in reality a controlled release of tension, a ritualized exhaustion designed to leave no structure untouched and no alternative unbroken. The defining illusion of the Clone Wars was symmetry. Two sides, two armies, two political identities. On the surface, this balance suggested uncertainty, the possibility that history might tilt in either direction. Beneath that surface, however, the conflict functioned less as a contest and more as a mechanism. It did not aim to resolve disagreement. It aimed to consume capacity. At the center of this mechanism stood Sheev Palpatine, not as a general or strategist, but as a curator of inevitability. He understood that wars do not need to be won if they can be prolonged. Duration, not victory, was the essential variable. A short war invites accountability. A long one dissolves it. From the Republic's perspective, the war was framed as defensive necessity. Separatist systems were portrayed as existential threats to unity and order. This framing mattered. Defensive wars justify extraordinary measures while preserving moral self-image. The Republic could expand its military, centralize authority, and suspend deliberation without acknowledging transformation. Each concession to urgency felt temporary. Each emergency felt isolated. They were neither. The creation of the clone army exemplifies this logic. An army grown, each owned and deployed by the state, removed the unpredictability of civilian conscription. It replaced moral hesitation with logistical efficiency. The clones did not debate. They executed. Their very existence normalized the idea that obedience could be engineered. This normalization reshaped the Republic's relationship with violence. The Jedi Order, once mediators and scholars, became generals. This transition is often treated as pragmatic adaptation, but its implications were profound. The Jedi's moral authority rested on their distance from political ambition. By leading armies, they collapsed that distance. Their role shifted from guardians of balance to instruments of state policy. Importantly, this shift was not forced upon them. It was presented as responsibility. Responsibility, when framed as necessity, can override principle without appearing to betray it. The Jedi believed that refusing command would endanger the Republic. They did not consider that accepting command might endanger themselves. In choosing participation over withdrawal, they tethered their identity to the war's outcome. This tethering ensured their vulnerability. The Separatists, meanwhile, served a complementary function. Their leadership was portrayed as ideologically driven, technologically obsessed, and morally compromised. This portrayal justified escalation. But the Separatists were never designed to win. Their purpose was to threaten convincingly enough to sustain fear. while remaining predictable enough to be managed. The war's structure ensured perpetual stalemate punctuated by localized victories. Each victory reinforced belief in eventual resolution, and each loss reinforced the need for continued effort. The cycle sustained itself, drawing resources inward and attention outward. What was being exhausted was not merely material, but imagination. As the war dragged on, the Republic's capacity to envision alternatives diminished. Diplomacy felt naive. Reform felt dangerous. Stability, even when increasingly authoritarian, felt preferable to uncertainty. The longer the war continued, the more unthinkable its end became without decisive consolidation of power. This is the quiet brilliance of predetermined conflict. When a war is structured to be endless, peace begins to feel like risk. The Jedi felt this erosion acutely. Their meditative practices were disrupted by constant deployment. Their connection to the Force became clouded not by darkness alone, but by noise. Endless decisions, endless casualties, endless justification. War did not corrupt their intentions. It depleted their clarity. They were no longer listening. They were reacting. From a distance, it is tempting to ask why the Jedi did not see the trap. But traps designed around normal responses are the hardest to recognize. The Jedi believed that service equaled virtue. They believed that presence equaled protection. They did not account for the possibility that participation itself was the objective. The Clone Wars also served a more subtle function. They reframed loyalty. Clones were conditioned to follow command structures without question. Senators deferred to executive authority. Systems deferred to military necessity. Obedience became synonymous with survival. By the time the war neared its conclusion, the galaxy had been trained to accept commands without context. This training made the final transition seamless. When the Republic transformed into the Empire, it did not feel like a rupture. It felt like a continuation under a new name. The war had already centralized authority, normalized surveillance, and justified militarization. The declaration merely acknowledged what had become structurally true. In this sense, the Clone Wars were not a tragedy that led to tyranny. They were the process by which tyranny was rendered acceptable. No decisive battle determined the war's outcome because outcome was never the goal. Exhaustion was. By draining the Jedi, habituating the public, and hollowing institutions, the conflict ensured that when change arrived, there would be no coherent resistance left to oppose it. And wars that are decided before they begin do not announce their conclusions. They simply stop, leaving behind a reality that feels permanent because nothing remains capable of imagining otherwise. In the next chapter, we will look closely at the moment often cited as the Jedi's destruction and examine why it was not, in truth, a military defeat at all, but the final expression of a psychological collapse that had been unfolding for years. When the moment arrived that history would later label as the destruction of the Jedi, it did not resemble defeat in any traditional sense. There was no prolonged siege of the temple, no decisive final stand, no grand recognition that an era was ending. What occurred instead was something quieter, faster, and far more revealing. A collapse that had already taken place internally, expressed outwardly in a single coordinated gesture. The Jedi did not fall because they were outnumbered. They fell because they were unprepared to imagine betrayal that arrived without chaos. For centuries, the Jedi Order had trained to confront threats that announced themselves through disruption. Rogue Force users, violent uprisings, visible corruption. Their philosophy assumed that darkness revealed itself through excess. What they were never trained to recognize was danger embedded within normality, carried out through obedience rather than rebellion. By the final days of the Clone Wars, the Jedi were psychologically overextended. Their attention was divided between military command, political advisory roles, and internal uncertainty about the Force itself. The clarity that once defined them had been replaced by vigilance. Vigilance, sustained over long periods, does not sharpen awareness. It narrows it. This narrowing mattered. The Jedi sensed that something was wrong. This is often emphasized. What is less discussed is that sensing danger is not the same as understanding it. They felt pressure without shape, threat without form. Their meditations were clouded not only by the dark side, but by cognitive dissonance, the strain of acting in ways that contradicted their foundational beliefs, while insisting those beliefs remained intact. They were, in effect, living in contradiction. The psychological burden of leading a war while claiming moral detachment cannot be overstated. Every decision carried weight. Every loss demanded justification. Over time, the Jedi adapted not by resolving this tension, but by normalizing it. What once felt like compromise began to feel like duty. What once felt temporary became routine. Routine is the enemy of perception. When the command that would later be known as Order 66 was issued, it succeeded not because it was sudden, but because it aligned perfectly with existing conditioning. The clone troopers did not experience the moment as betrayal. They experienced it as procedure. Their obedience had been cultivated carefully, consistently, and without visible cruelty. The Jedi, meanwhile, experienced shock, not because they were attacked, but because the attack violated their assumptions about loyalty. They had come to trust the system because they were part of it. They trusted the chain of command because they occupied positions within it. They trusted the clones because they had fought beside them. This trust was not naive. It was institutional. And institutional trust, once misplaced, fails catastrophically. What followed was not a battle. It was disorientation. Jedi across the galaxy died not because they were weaker than their attackers, but because their mental framework could not process what was happening quickly enough to respond. They hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of disbelief, as the time it took to reinterpret reality was the time in which they were lost. This is why the fall of the Jedi cannot be understood solely through numbers or tactics. Militarily, they were formidable. Psychologically, they were unanchored. The deeper collapse had already occurred within the temple itself. The council, once a forum for contemplation, had become a body tasked with risk management. Debate was constrained by urgency. Doubt was postponed in favor of action. The Jedi's internal culture had shifted from inquiry to execution. This shift eroded resilience. Resilient systems adapt when assumptions fail. Rigid systems fracture. The Jedi Order, bound by doctrine and burdened by expectation, had become rigid in precisely the ways that mattered most. When the unthinkable occurred, There was no philosophical elasticity left to absorb it. Even their relationship with the Force reflected this strain. The Jedi spoke often of its guidance, yet increasingly struggled to hear it clearly. War had transformed their connection from dialogue into demand. They asked the Force for outcomes rather than insight. When the Force responded with silence, they interpreted it as obstruction rather than warning. The psychological isolation of the Jedi in their final years is often overlooked. Though numerous, they were increasingly alone, separated from the civilian population by role, from the Senate by secrecy, and from one another by unspoken doubt. Community, once their greatest strength, had thinned into coordination. Coordination cannot replace trust. Now, the irony is that the Jedi feared attachment because they believed it compromised judgment. In their final moments, what compromised them was not attachment, but abstraction. They had become symbols of order rather than participants in life. When the system they served turned against them, there was no informal network left to provide warning or refuge. Their fall, then, was not the result of being targeted. It was the result of being positioned. By the time the order was given, the Jedi had already been defined as expendable within the logic of the Republic's transformation. Their removal was not framed as murder, but as security. This reframing was possible only because the Jedi had allowed themselves to be understood primarily as functionaries, rather than as moral interlocutors. In this sense, the fall of the Jedi was complete before the first blaster was fired. The physical destruction merely confirmed what had already taken place internally. The erosion of interpretive freedom, the loss of adaptive identity, and the quiet substitution of role for purpose. What remained after their fall was not merely absence, but silence. A silence shaped by the realization that moral authority, once embedded too deeply in systems of power, cannot survive those systems unchanged. In the next chapter, we will examine the structure that replaced the Republic, not as an aberration, but as a form of stability many in the galaxy accepted willingly, and why tyranny, when it arrives slowly enough, often feels like relief rather than loss. When the Republic ended, it did not do so in flames. There was no universal outcry, no sudden rupture in daily life for most citizens of the galaxy. What followed felt to many less like loss and more like quiet relief. This is the most unsettling aspect of the transition. Tyranny did not arrive as an invasion. It arrived as an answer. The Republic had not fallen because it lacked ideals. It fell because ideals had become unmanageable under strain. By the final years of the Clone Wars, exhaustion was the dominant condition of galactic life. Trade routes were unstable. Local governments were overwhelmed. Endless emergency sessions replaced deliberation. For ordinary systems and citizens alike, the question was no longer what is right, but what will end this. Into this environment emerged the Galactic Empire, framed not as a radical departure, but as a consolidation. Its language was administrative rather than ideological. Order, security, efficiency, continuity. These were not words of conquest. They were words of repair. This framing mattered. Tyranny that declares itself invites resistance. Tyranny that presents itself as maintenance invites compliance. The Empire did not promise moral renewal. It promised predictability. After years of chaos, Predictability felt humane. The Senate's continued existence, at least initially, reinforced this illusion. Familiar faces remained. Procedures continued. Laws were not erased overnight. They were streamlined. The Empire did not demand that citizens abandon their identities. It asked only that they defer more often, question less frequently, and trust centralized authority to handle what individuals no longer could. Trust had already been trained. The Clone Wars conditioned the galaxy to associate survival with obedience. Systems learned that hesitation could be catastrophic. Citizens learned that extraordinary measures could become routine without immediate consequence. By the time the Empire formalized these patterns, resistance felt impractical rather than righteous. Importantly, the Empire did not rely solely on fear in its early years. Fear is costly. It requires constant reinforcement. Instead, it relied on administrative distance. Decisions were made far away, by figures unseen. Suffering became abstracted. Responsibility dissolved into hierarchy. This diffusion of responsibility is essential to understanding acceptance. When harm occurs slowly, incrementally, and without a single identifiable perpetrator, moral urgency fades. Each individual action seems tolerable in isolation. Each compromise feels temporary. Over time, the accumulation becomes irreversible, but no single moment feels worth resisting. The Empire mastered this gradualism. Many planetary systems experienced real improvements in the short term. Piracy declined along heavily militarized routes. Separatist holdouts were eliminated. Infrastructure projects moved forward without legislative gridlock. For those distant from the Empire's repressive core, these changes felt stabilizing. Oppression, when unevenly distributed, often goes unnoticed by those it does not immediately affect. This unevenness fractured empathy. Core worlds experienced order without overt brutality. Outer systems experienced control without recourse, as the lack of shared experience prevented unified opposition. Discontent remained localized, fragmented, and easily dismissed as isolated unrest rather than systemic failure. The absence of the Jedi further normalized this reality. For generations, the Jedi had served as a visible moral counterweight to political authority. Their disappearance created a vacuum not only of power, but of interpretation. Without them, there was no widely trusted institution capable of naming imbalance. The Empire filled this void with narrative, presenting itself as the sole guardian against chaos. Security became morality. In such a framework, dissent could be reframed as irresponsibility. Protest could be labeled destabilization. Fear of disorder became more persuasive than hope for justice. Citizens did not need to love the Empire, as they needed only to believe that opposing it would make things worse, and many did. This is why rebellion took so long to coalesce. It is also why early resistance was so fragile. Those who opposed the Empire were not only confronting military power, but social inertia. They had to persuade others that the absence of freedom was more dangerous than the presence of chaos. A difficult argument to make in a galaxy traumatized by war. The Empire understood this trauma and preserved it. Public memory of the Clone Wars was curated carefully. Conflict was emphasized. Loss was highlighted. The Republic was remembered not as an ideal corrupted, but as a failure replaced. In this retelling, the Empire was not the cause of suffering, but its remedy. This narrative did not need to be universally believed, and it needed only to be unchallenged often enough. Tyranny, in this sense, thrives less on cruelty than on fatigue. It persists not because people agree with it, but because they no longer have the energy to imagine alternatives. Stability becomes sacred. Disruption becomes sin. The tragedy is not that the galaxy accepted the Empire. It is that acceptance felt rational. By the time overt oppression became undeniable, the structures required to oppose it had already been dismantled or co-opted. Local governance had been weakened. Independent militaries had been absorbed. Moral authority had been centralized and redefined. What remained was endurance. In the next chapter, we will turn to the movement that arose within this endurance, the rebellion, and examine how even resistance, shaped by the same historical pressures, carried within it unresolved contradictions inherited from the Republic it sought to restore. Resistance is often imagined as clarity returning to a darkened world. Yet movements born within collapsed systems rarely escape the assumptions of those systems entirely. The rebellion did not emerge from a philosophical vacuum. It arose from within the long shadow of the Republic and the Empire alike, inheriting not only their hopes, but also their unresolved contradictions. At its surface, the Rebel Alliance presented a moral corrective. It opposed centralized tyranny, rejected absolute authority, and fought to restore self-determination to systems stripped of voice. These aims were sincere. They were also incomplete. The paradox of the rebellion lies not in its cause, but in its structure. The Alliance defined itself against the Galactic Empire, yet it relied on many of the same logics the Empire had normalized. Militarization became necessity. Secrecy became survival. Hierarchies formed quickly, justified by urgency. Decisions were centralized, not because it was ideal, but because it was efficient. Efficiency, once normalized, is difficult to relinquish. The rebellion's early years were shaped by scarcity, of resources, of safe havens, of time. Under such conditions, ideals compress. What cannot be defended immediately is deferred. What cannot be measured is sidelined. Strategy eclipses philosophy. In this environment, victory becomes synonymous with validation. This is how paradox takes root. The Alliance sought to restore a republic, yet it rarely interrogated what had failed in the Republic to begin with. Its rhetoric focused on freedom from tyranny, not on the structural fragilities that had allowed tyranny to emerge. But the assumption was implicit. Remove the Emperor, restore the Senate, and balance would return. History suggests otherwise. Many within the rebellion carried lived memory of the Republic's decay. Yet trauma often seeks reversal rather than reimagining. The desire was not to create something new, but to recover what was lost. Nostalgia can motivate resistance, but it can also limit vision. The rebellion's relationship with the Force illustrates this tension. With the Jedi largely absent, the Alliance did not develop a new philosophical framework for Force engagement. Instead, it deferred the question entirely, treating the Force as symbolic rather than systemic. Hope was placed in individuals rather than institutions. This mirrored an older pattern. Balance entrusted to exceptional figures rather than cultivated collectively, whilst the pattern persisted because it was familiar. Operationally, the rebellion depended on decisive actions, strikes, sabotage, targeted destruction. These tactics were effective against a vast, rigid empire, yet they also reinforced a binary worldview: us versus them, liberation versus control. Complexity was a luxury the movement believed it could not afford. But complexity does not disappear when ignored. The alliance struggled with internal cohesion precisely because it brought together disparate systems with conflicting priorities. Some sought independence, others sought reform, others sought revenge. Unity was achieved not through shared philosophy, but through shared opposition. As long as the Empire existed, this was enough. The danger lay in what would follow. Revolutions that define themselves primarily by what they oppose often find themselves unprepared to govern once opposition ends. The rebellion's strength, its moral clarity against tyranny, risked becoming a weakness when asked to articulate a positive, sustainable alternative. Even its symbolism carried contradiction. The language of hope was central to rebel identity, yet hope was often externalized, placed in victories, leaders, or symbols, rather than cultivated through structural change. This made morale vulnerable to loss. When defeats occurred, doubt spread quickly. When victories occurred, they were burdened with disproportionate meaning. This emotional volatility mirrored the very instability the alliance opposed. None of this negates the rebellion's necessity. Without it, the Empire would have endured unchallenged. But necessity does not equal completeness. The alliance was shaped by the same historical pressures that shaped the Republic and the Empire: fear of chaos, reliance on central figures, and the belief that moral ends could justify structural shortcuts. The hidden paradox is this: the rebellion fought to restore freedom while operating within frameworks forged by unfreedom. This paradox did not doom the movement, but it constrained it. It meant that victory would not automatically produce wisdom. It meant that the fall of the Empire would resolve power without resolving philosophy. It meant that the deeper question, how to live with the Force, with authority, with difference, remained unanswered. In this sense, the rebellion was less an endpoint than a bridge. It carried the galaxy away from overt tyranny, but not yet toward mature balance. And that work would fall not to fleets or councils, but to individuals capable of synthesizing what had been divided for generations. In the next chapter, we will turn to one such individual, not as a warrior or symbol, but as a quiet corrective, and explore how a different relationship with emotion, attachment, and restraint offered a path neither the Jedi nor the Sith had fully seen. In the long arc of galactic history, some figures alter events, while others alter interpretation. Luke Skywalker belongs to the latter category. His significance does not rest in conquest or command, but in a subtle reorientation of how power, emotion, and restraint might coexist. Where others sought resolution through dominance or denial, Luke arrived at something quieter: integration. Luke's early life placed him at a distance from the institutions that had shaped prior generations. He did not grow up within the Jedi Order's doctrine, nor was he groomed within the political machinery of the Republic or Empire. This absence, often framed as disadvantage, proved formative. Without inherited certainty, Luke approached the Force without expectation of mastery. Curiosity preceded control. This orientation mattered. But when Luke first encountered the teachings of the Jedi, he did so through fragments, stories, practices, and principles filtered through loss. There was no intact order to impose completeness. What he received instead were incomplete maps. This forced interpretation. He could not rely on doctrine alone. He had to listen inwardly. Luke's training emphasized discipline, yet it did not erase emotion. Fear, hope, frustration, and attachment were present from the beginning. Unlike Anakin, Luke was not asked to deny these states. He was warned of their consequences, but allowed to experience them. This difference, though subtle, altered everything. The Jedi of old sought purity. Luke sought understanding. His attachments, particularly to family, were not severed. They were acknowledged. When faced with loss, and Luke did not interpret grief as failure. He interpreted it as information. This allowed him to act not in spite of emotion, but through it, without surrendering to it entirely. This balance is difficult to define precisely because it resists extremes. Luke's confrontation with darkness did not culminate in domination. It culminated in refusal. The moment that defines his legacy is not a victory of strength, but a decision of restraint informed by compassion. He did not reject anger because it existed. He rejected it because he understood where it led. This distinction reveals a matured relationship with the Force. The Force, as Luke engaged with it, was not a moral judge. It was a responsive medium. It amplified intention, not ideology. By acknowledging his capacity for darkness, without identifying with it, Luke avoided the fragmentation that had undone both Jedi and Sith traditions. His refusal to complete the cycle of violence did something no prophecy had managed to accomplish. It interrupted inevitability. What Luke demonstrated was not that light must destroy dark, but that awareness can dissolve compulsion. This insight reframes balance not as static equilibrium, but as ongoing choice. Balance is not achieved once. It is practiced continually. Importantly, Luke did not seek to rebuild the Jedi Order as it had been. His hesitation is often interpreted as doubt or failure. In truth, it reflects discernment. Luke understood, perhaps intuitively, that restoring form without revising philosophy would recreate the same conditions that had led to collapse. This awareness set him apart. Luke's legacy is not an institution, but an example. Yet he embodied a synthesis that neither the Jedi nor the Sith had sustained. Emotional honesty without surrender, power without domination, attachment without possession. This synthesis was not codified. It could not be enforced. It could only be modeled. Modeling is slower than doctrine, but more resilient. In Luke, the galaxy glimpsed an alternative path, one where individuals are not asked to amputate parts of themselves to wield power responsibly, nor encouraged to indulge every impulse in the name of authenticity. Instead, they are asked to remain present with contradiction. This presence is uncomfortable. It resists absolutes. It requires continual self-examination, but it aligns more closely with the nature of the Force itself, which moves not toward purity, but toward responsiveness. Luke did not end conflict. He changed its grammar. By choosing compassion over certainty, he demonstrated that balance does not emerge from victory alone. It emerges when the impulse to dominate gives way to the willingness to understand. In doing so, he completed something the prophecy never articulated clearly. not the destruction of darkness, but the reintegration of choice. In the final chapter, we will step back from individuals entirely and consider the saga as a whole, not as a tale of heroes and villains, but as a meditation crafted by its creator on cycles of fear, control, and the fragile conditions required for enlightened societies to endure. When distance is finally introduced, when characters recede into history and events soften into pattern, the Star Wars saga reveals itself less as a space fantasy and more as a meditation on cycles. Not cycles of battle, but of belief. Not of heroes and villains, but of how societies repeatedly misunderstand power, fear, and control. At this scale, the figure of George Lucas becomes less an architect of lore and more a quiet observer of history, translating human patterns into mythic language. What he was writing about was never the Force alone. It was the conditions under which civilizations rise, stabilize, rigidify, and collapse. The Jedi, the Sith, the Republic, the Empire, and the Rebellion are not opposites in a moral sense. They are phases. Each emerges as a response to the failures of the previous structure. Each carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. This is the saga's most consistent rhythm. The Republic begins as an answer to chaos, privileging dialogue, shared governance, and restraint. Over time, its processes become slow, its compromises habitual, its ideals procedural rather than lived. Fear of instability overtakes commitment to reform. Control begins to feel safer than trust. The Jedi arise to stabilize power, to ensure that extraordinary ability does not fracture ordinary life. In doing so, they institutionalize wisdom. Over generations, wisdom becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes identity. Identity becomes rigidity. What began as protection becomes limitation. The Sith emerge not as invaders, but as counterweights, embodying what has been suppressed rather than erased. Their intensity answers Jedi denial, but overshoots into domination. Where one side refuses emotion, the other absolutizes it. Balance is sought through exclusion on both ends. The Empire is not a deviation from this arc. It is its compression. It is what happens when fear of disorder becomes more powerful than desire for freedom. The Empire does not invent tyranny. It refines it, making it efficient, legal, and psychologically acceptable. The Rebellion, in turn, reacts against visible oppression, but carries forward unresolved assumptions that removing a tyrant restores balance, that dismantling power structures automatically produces wisdom, that moral clarity in opposition translates into moral clarity in governance. Lucas does not present these as mistakes made once. He presents them as mistakes made repeatedly. What the saga suggests, quietly, persistently, is that no system fails because it is evil. Systems fail because they stop listening. They privilege preservation over responsiveness. They mistake stability for balance and control for wisdom. The Force, in this reading, is not a mystical energy field divided into light and dark. It is a metaphor for consequence. It amplifies intention. It reflects imbalance. It does not judge. It responds. When individuals or institutions act from fear, the Force carries that fear forward. When they act from awareness, it opens space for integration. This is why the saga resists clean resolution. Even after the fall of the Empire, there is no final peace. The cycle does not end because the underlying question remains unanswered. How does a society hold power without becoming afraid of its own fragility? How does it cultivate order without erasing dissent, restraint without denial, strength without domination? Luke's story gestures toward an answer, but does not finalize it. That too is intentional. Lucas does not offer blueprints. He offers warnings. The deepest warning is this: enlightenment cannot be institutionalized without loss. The moment wisdom becomes law, it begins to decay. The moment balance is defined too precisely, it becomes brittle. The moment fear is treated as something to eliminate rather than understand, it returns with greater force. Star Wars endures not because of its spectacle, but because it recognizes something enduringly human. Civilizations do not collapse from invasion alone. They collapse from certainty. They collapse when they believe they have solved the problem of power once and for all. What Lucas was really writing about was not a galaxy far away, but a mirror, one that reflects our recurring temptation to trade complexity for comfort, and our recurring hope that awareness, however fragile, can interrupt the cycle. There is no final victory in this story. Only vigilance. Only listening. Only the quiet work of balance, practiced again and again by individuals who understand that the Force, like history, does not belong to anyone. And in that understanding, the saga finally comes to rest.